Her little hands shook as she grabbed the strange man's arm. Tears carved paths down her dirty face, and her voice cracked with each word she spoke. "They are hurting my sister. She is going to die." A hush fell over the entire room. The clinking of glasses ceased. Every single person turned to look at her, but the man she pleaded with was not just any person. He was Dominic Caruso, the most dreaded mafia leader in all of Chicago, a man known only as the Reaper. And what he did in that moment was something nobody in that room would ever be able to forget. You need to stay with me, because the events that unfold will move you to tears. This story carries a truth that will stay with you long after it ends. Sometimes the smallest hands can break through the thickest walls. Sometimes saving another person is how we finally save ourselves. What you are about to witness is not just a mafia story. It is a story about a man who buried his heart for 10 years, and a 6-year-old girl who dug it back up with nothing but tears and courage. If you believe that redemption is possible for even the darkest souls, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Hit the like button if you are ready for a story that will shake you to your core. And share this with someone who needs to remember that hope can come from the most unexpected places. Now let us return to that freezing Tuesday night in Chicago. It was a frigid Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago, in the year 2024. The Velvet Crown restaurant was filled with the low hum of conversation from men in tailored suits, their whispers of business deals mingling with the scent of expensive whiskey. This was not a typical restaurant. It was Dominic Caruso's personal territory. Every employee there knew to hear nothing and say less. Every guest understood the silent code. You mind your own affairs, you show your respect, and you never, ever start any trouble. Dominic Caruso occupied his regular corner table inside the VIP section, a man whose presence alone inspired a mixture of reverence and fear. At 36 years old, he had constructed a criminal empire that spanned across 3 different states. His sharp, steel-gray eyes saw everything. His command was absolute law. And on this night, just like every Tuesday for the last 10 years, he was holding his weekly briefing with his most trusted lieutenants. The discussion was quiet and disciplined. They reviewed figures, they allocated territories, and they solved problems with clinical efficiency. This was Dominic's way of operating: methodical, precise, never allowing feelings to interfere with his decisions. He had survived in this brutal world far longer than most, because he grasped a single, essential truth. Emotion was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a death sentence. But then something happened, the one event that would demolish the fortress Dominic had painstakingly built around his heart for a full decade. The restaurant's massive oak door was thrown open with such raw power that it crashed loudly against the interior wall. Every head snapped in its direction. Conversation stopped in the middle of a word. The manager scurried forward, his face a mask of white-hot panic. But before he could stop the intruder, everyone saw the source of the disturbance. A small girl, who could not have been more than 6 years old, was standing frozen in the entryway. Her flimsy nightgown was ripped and filthy. A dark stain of blood, which was not her own, covered the white cloth. Her brown hair was a tangled mess around a face streaked with grime and dried tears. Her bare feet were bright red from the bitter cold. She appeared as though she had clawed her way through hell just to arrive here. The child's eyes scanned the room with raw desperation, seeking out something or someone, anyone at all who could offer help. The diners simply stared back, completely stunned. A few looked away, made uncomfortable by the disruption. Others began to whisper, irritated that their private evening had been ruined by what they assumed was just another street child begging for change. But this little girl was not looking for spare change. She was searching for a savior. Her desperate eyes finally settled on Dominic Caruso's table, and some deep, innocent part of her recognized real power when she saw it. Perhaps it was the way the other men at the table deferred to him. It could have been the expensive cut of his suit, or the gold watch that shimmered under the dim lights. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something more fundamental, a child's instinct that unerringly identified the only person in that entire room with the ability to actually change things. With no hesitation, she bolted straight for him. The air in the room grew thick as everyone held their breath. Dominic's bodyguards immediately stiffened, their hands instinctively moving to the weapons concealed in their jackets. This was completely unheard of. Nobody ever approached Dominic Caruso without an invitation, and certainly not like this. But before a single person could make a move, the little girl had reached Dominic's table and seized his sleeve with both of her hands. Her small fingers gripped the expensive material like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. The blood on her hands, her sister's blood, smeared across his suit. Then she uttered the words that would haunt Dominic Caruso for the rest of his days. "They are hurting my sister. She is dying. She is all I have left in this world. Please, I am begging you, save her." The silence that came after was absolute. You could have heard a feather fall to the floor in that restaurant. All eyes were fixed on Dominic, waiting to see how the famously ruthless crime boss would react to this impossible situation. His entire reputation was founded on being untouchable. He was a cold man, one who offered mercy to absolutely no one. Dominic gazed down at the child who was clinging to his arm. Her face was tilted up to meet his. Her brown eyes were wide with a heartbreaking mix of terror and hope. In that single instant, something inside the hardened criminal's chest shifted, a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience for 10 long years. This little girl, she was the exact same age Sophia had been the last time he ever saw her. 10 years ago, Dominic Caruso had been a different person. At 26, he was already positioned high within his father's organization, learning the brutal business that had forged their family's great fortune. But even with the darkness that defined his everyday existence, Dominic had two sources of genuine light: his mother, Isabella, and his 16-year-old sister, Sophia. Isabella Caruso was the kindest heart in a world full of savage predators. At 52, she held on to the belief that her son would one day escape the criminal life. Every Sunday, she would prepare pasta by hand, making the house smell of garlic and fresh tomatoes, and for a few precious hours, she would pretend they were just a regular family. She offered no judgment. She spoke no condemnation. She just loved him without condition and without end. But it was Sophia who truly possessed Dominic's heart. Sophia was 16 years old, with the very same brown eyes that Dominic now saw looking up at him from this little girl's face. She was a brilliant student, always at the top of her class, with dreams of attending medical school. She was determined to become a doctor, to save lives rather than to take them. She was the bright light in a family consumed by shadows. She was the one pure good thing that Dominic would have done anything to keep safe. Each morning, it did not matter how late his business had kept him up the night before, Dominic was the one who drove Sophia to her school. Every single afternoon, he was there to pick her up. He carefully vetted all of her friends. He frightened away any boy who dared to look at her for too long, and he made absolutely certain she never learned the real truth about what their family did for a living. Sophia was destined for another kind of life, a much better one. He had sworn that to himself, but such promises are worthless to men who crave only power. The Castellano family had been their rivals for many years, clashing over territory, over profits, and over simple pride. When their negotiations ultimately failed, they chose to deliver a message, not to Dominic's father, but by targeting the only thing that could ever truly break him. They abducted Isabella and Sophia on a Wednesday night, taking them directly from the parking lot of Sophia's school. The demand for ransom arrived within a few hours. The Castellanos wanted territory, a large sum of money, and a public admission of defeat. Dominic pleaded with his father to pay it, to give them anything they asked for. But Antonio Caruso was a man of rigid principles, cold and unyielding principles, that placed his reputation far above his own family. "We do not negotiate with vermin," his father had said, "and act like that would make us appear weak." 48 hours later, their bodies were discovered. Isabella had been killed instantly, a small act of mercy. But Sophia, his dear Sophia, had died while trying to shield her mother from harm. The medical examiner reported that she had resisted, that she had tried to protect the very woman who had given her life. When Dominic went to identify her body, he saw something that completely obliterated what was left of his soul. Sophia's fingers were still tightly clutched around a small silver necklace, the exact one Dominic had given her for her 16th birthday only 3 weeks earlier. The pendant on the chain was a tiny angel wing. "Because you are my angel," he had once told her, and now his angel was gone forever. What occurred after that became a dark legend in the Chicago underworld. Over 6 months, Dominic methodically annihilated the Castellano family, every single member, every known associate, every last person who had known about the kidnapping and had failed to act. He offered zero mercy, because no mercy had been given to anyone that he loved. When all the bloodshed finally ended, Dominic Caruso was left standing alone at the very top, the youngest boss in the history of the organization, and by far the most feared. But he was also the most hollow. That night, as he stood over his sister's grave, Dominic took an oath. He would never love anyone again. He would never permit himself to care for another living soul. Sentiment was the very weakness that had led to the deaths of his mother and sister, and that kind of weakness would never touch him again. For 10 years, Dominic held true to that promise. He constructed walls around his heart that were so high and so thick that nothing could ever get through. He became the Reaper, a man without pity, without empathy, without a heart. Until this very night, until a 6-year-old girl with familiar brown eyes looked up at him with the same complete trust that Sophia once had. The memory vanished as swiftly as it had appeared, but its immense weight remained, pressing down on Dominic's chest like a slab of concrete. He blinked, and he was once again in the velvet crown. The small girl was still clutching his sleeve, her tiny frame shaking, her eyes, those painfully familiar brown eyes, begging him to do something, to do anything at all. The entire room was still suspended in time. Nobody dared to shift in their seat. Nobody dared to even breathe. Then, Dominic Caruso did something that sent a shockwave through every single person in that restaurant. He rose to his feet. The legs of his chair scraped against the polished marble floor, and the sound sliced through the profound silence like a knife. His lieutenants shared looks of complete disbelief. In all the years they had served him, they had never once witnessed their boss react to any situation with such suddenness. Dominic then lowered himself down to one knee, which brought his own face level with the child's. This close, he could clearly see the clean paths the tears had made. He asked for her name, his voice possessing a gentleness no one present had ever witnessed from him before. "Lily," she breathed, the word barely a sound. He repeated it, "Lily," letting the name settle on his tongue as if committing it to memory. "Where does your sister live?" Through a series of gasps and sobs, the small child managed to give him an address. It was a decaying apartment complex in the South Side, located in one of Chicago's most dangerous sectors. Dominic recognized the location instantly. It was contested ground for the Black Cobus, a street crew that had been a thorn in his side for months. He shifted his gaze to Marco, his most loyal lieutenant, who was paralyzed with shock. "Prepare the vehicles, every single one of them, immediately." Marco's hesitation was only for a moment, but it was enough to earn him a glare from Dominic so cold it could extinguish fire. The older man gave a sharp nod, pulling out his cell phone and snapping commands as he headed for the exit. Dominic's attention returned to Lily. The little girl was now trembling uncontrollably, her teeth chattering from a combination of the cold and overwhelming fear. On pure instinct, he removed his own jacket, a custom piece worth $10,000 that he guarded possessively, and carefully settled it over her tiny frame. The garment engulfed her, its hem falling past her knees like a heavy cloak. Then he did something he had not done in a decade. He lifted her into his arms. Lily's small arms instantly circled his neck as she pressed her face into the fabric of his shirt. She felt impossibly light, a delicate being made of little more than bone, hope, and sheer desperation. Dominic felt something fundamental fracture deep inside him, a crack spreading through defenses he had spent 10 years building. Outside, the engines of 5 black sport utility vehicles ignited with a collective roar. Dominic strode out of the restaurant carrying Lily, oblivious to the astonished looks from his men and the rumors that would certainly ignite through Chicago's criminal network by sunrise. Nothing else mattered. In the rear of the main vehicle, Lily would not release his hand. Her small fingers, still marked with blood that did not belong to her, clung to his with a strength that defied her size. She remained silent. Her grip was relentless, as though he was the only thing keeping her head above water. Dominic glanced down at the small, trusting hand holding his, and a feeling washed over him he had not known since the evening he lost Sophia. It was the feeling of being accountable for another soul. But to truly grasp why this one night would alter the course of everything, you must first learn about a young woman by the name of Olivia Bennet and the 27 years of torment she had endured. Olivia Bennet's life began in shadows. Chicago, 1997. The year opened with a fierce blizzard that entombed the city under 3 feet of snow. In a cramped West Side apartment, a baby girl took her first breath. There was no celebration from her parents. They were far too consumed with finding their next fix. Richard and Diane Bennett were slaves to their habits long before Olivia's arrival. Heroin, cocaine, any substance they could find. The pregnancy had been an unforeseen complication. The baby was an unwelcome burden. From the moment she was born, Olivia was not wanted. For 8 years, she managed to exist inside that apartment. She figured out how to get her own food by age 4, foraging in cupboards for old crackers and long-expired cans of soup. She taught herself to be silent when her parents were high, to retreat into a closet when unfamiliar people visited, to effectively disappear. There were nights without any food. There were nights without any warmth. But Olivia learned to adapt, the way children must when existence itself is the only goal. Then the day arrived when her parents concluded she was more trouble than she was worth. She was only 8 years old. They drove her to a downtown bus depot, gave her a small backpack containing 2 sets of clothes, and instructed her to wait right there. "We will be right back," her mother promised, her gaze avoiding Olivia's. "Just wait here." Olivia sat there for 6 long hours until a police officer noticed her. Her parents were never heard from again. The foster care system then consumed her. For the following 8 years, Olivia was passed through 7 different households, 7 different sets of adults who were meant to provide care, to offer protection, to give her some semblance of a normal life. Every single one failed her. The initial 3 homes saw her as nothing more than a government check, a state-provided stipend that paid for a roof and the bare minimum of food. She was an obligation, another mouth to feed, a presence to be overlooked. Nobody ever asked about her school day. Nobody offered help with her assignments. Nobody was concerned. The 4th home was worse, far worse. Olivia would never speak of what took place within those walls. She pushed those memories down so far that she could sometimes make herself believe they were just nightmares. But the wounds remained, invisible scars that cut deeper than anything physical. She learned to make herself insignificant, to become a ghost, to never attract any notice. Notice always led to pain. At 15, Olivia decided she could not take any more. She ran, vanishing onto the Chicago streets with only the clothes she was wearing. She survived for 3 months by herself, finding a bed in shelters when there was room and sleeping beneath bridges when there was not. She shoplifted food from corner stores. She memorized which streets were safe to walk and which ones were a death sentence. Inevitably, the authorities located her. She was placed in a juvenile detention facility, where she remained for the next year, internalizing the one lesson that would define her life. Trust no one. Rely on no one. Never expect anything from anybody. When she finally aged out of the state's care at 18, Olivia Bennet had constructed fortifications around her heart as formidable as Dominic Caruso's. She was utterly alone, without family, without resources, without a path forward. She was convinced her life was destined to be a continuous loop of darkness, a tunnel with no light. That is, until a single telephone call changed her entire world. The call happened on a Tuesday. Olivia was 16, locked inside the juvenile facility, just marking time until she was old enough to legally escape the system that had betrayed her so completely. When a counselor informed her that her mother was on the phone, a bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. "My mother left me 8 years ago," she stated with no emotion. "I do not have a mother." Yet, curiosity was a powerful force. It always was. On the phone, Diane Bennett's voice was different. It was sharper, without the usual slur. She told a story of getting clean, securing a job, and completely changing her life. She said she needed to see Olivia. She needed to say she was sorry. She was asking for another chance. Olivia did not trust a single syllable. Nevertheless, she agreed to go. Perhaps it was a flicker of hope, that small, resilient flame that refused to be put out no matter how many times life had tried to snuff it. Or perhaps she simply had to see her mother face to face and tell the woman who had discarded her like trash exactly what she thought of her. The apartment was a small yet tidy studio on the south side that carried the scent of artificial air freshener and cheap instant coffee. Diane appeared much older and thinner, with profound dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of makeup could conceal. A nervous smile touched her lips as she opened the door, and for a fleeting second, Olivia felt a pang of pity. That feeling vanished when she heard it. The sound of an infant crying, coming from a bassinet tucked away in the room's corner. A chill went through Olivia's entire body. "What is that?" Diane's manufactured smile disappeared. That is your sister, Lily. She is almost 1 year old." Sister. The word struck Olivia with the force of a physical blow. Her mother had found a replacement, had created a new child, built a new family, and continued on as if Olivia was never born. She knew she should have left then and there. She should have pivoted and walked away for good. But then, the infant's cries subsided. Olivia felt herself walking toward the bassinet, pulled by an impulse she could not name. When she peered inside, a pair of wide, trusting brown eyes looked up at her, full of pure innocence. Lily reached up a tiny hand and made a happy sound, as though she saw something familiar in Olivia's face. In that instant, something deep within Olivia's fortified heart began to shift. A wall inside her had cracked open. From that day on, she made a visit every single week, rationalizing that she was only checking on Lily's well-being. It was obvious her mother was still using drugs. Olivia recognized all the familiar indicators from her own childhood: the trembling hands, the unnaturally wide pupils, the effortless stream of lies. The inevitable overdose occurred 6 months later. Olivia was 17, standing in a sterile hospital corridor, as a social worker explained that Lily was being put into foster care. It was the very same system that had shattered Olivia's own youth, the living nightmare she had barely managed to escape. Her mind flashed to the closets where she used to hide, the countless meals she went without, the fourth family, and every unspeakable thing that came with it. "No," she stated, her voice soft but firm. The social worker paused. "I beg your pardon? I am taking her. I will take my sister." That very night, Olivia held Lily in her arms as her official legal guardian for the first time. The baby slept soundly, her tiny hand curled securely around Olivia's finger. In that quiet, profound moment, Olivia made a solemn vow. "I will give you the kind of life I was never allowed to have, and I will do whatever it takes." For 10 years, Olivia honored that commitment, no matter the personal cost. A decade of fulfilling that promise had left Olivia Bennett on the verge of breaking. At 27, she carried the appearance of someone much older. Permanent dark circles were etched beneath her eyes. Her hands were coarse and chapped from years of hard labor. A persistent, dull ache lived in her back, a pain that was her constant companion. And yet, every single morning, Regardless of her profound exhaustion, Olivia would rise and face it all again, because Lily depended on her. Their home was a studio apartment on the south side, 400 square feet of decaying plaster and shattered hopes. The building's heater had been unreliable for 2 years, forcing them to sleep buried under 3 blankets in the winter. Roaches scurried from fissures in the walls that Olivia had attempted to block with duct tape and wads of newspaper. The ceiling would drip whenever it rained, leaving behind ugly brown water stains that grew across it like a creeping sickness. Across the plaster. It was the only home they had ever known. To keep that inadequate roof above their heads, Olivia worked 3 separate jobs. Her day began at 4:30 in the morning, when a shrill alarm ripped her from sleep. By 5, she stood at her post behind the counter of Morning Brew, a downtown coffee shop serving businessmen who never met her gaze. For 6 long hours, she forced a smile for demanding customers, endured scalding coffee burns on her hands, and collected tips that seldom amounted to more than $20. At midday, she started her shift at Petal and Vine, a little flower boutique on Madison Street. Mrs. Chen, the kind owner, often allowed Olivia to bring home any bruised or damaged flowers for Lily. She spent another 6 hours there, crafting beautiful bouquets for extravagant weddings she could never have, for the funerals of people she never knew, and for lovers celebrating a life she could only imagine. Then, at 8 in the evening, as others settled in with their families, Olivia pulled on a pair of rubber gloves and began cleaning office buildings until midnight. She cleaned toilets and vacuumed vast carpets, and emptied wastebaskets overflowing with leftover meals that cost more than her daily wages. She survived on 4 hours of sleep before the cycle started all over again. Her own body was beginning to fail her. In the winter, her hands would crack and bleed, no matter what lotion she used. Her lower back would spasm without any warning, leaving her breathless with pain in the middle of serving a customer. She had dropped 15 pounds in the last year, a weight she simply could not spare. But all that pain was nothing next to Lily's condition, a congenital heart defect. The doctors found it when Lily was just 3. Her heart would give out eventually without a major surgery. That life-saving operation carried a price tag of $80,000, a figure so large it was meaningless to someone who barely earned enough for rent and food. For 3 years, Olivia had saved every penny, skipping her own meals and wearing clothes until they were threadbare. She had managed to put away $12,000, a fraction of what was needed. And then there was the other, more menacing debt. The Black Cobras ruled the South Side with absolute power and zero compassion. Every shop and every person living there paid them for protection. It was $200 each month just to keep their windows from being broken, or far worse. Olivia had gotten behind on payments during Lily's most recent stay in the hospital. Now, she was in debt for $2,400 to men who did not care about her reasons. So she kept her gaze low, steered clear of any trouble, worked her body into the ground, and prayed for a better day that never seemed to come. But a different kind of shadow was stalking Olivia, one even more menacing than a street gang. His name was Tyler Ashford. Olivia had first encountered Tyler Ashford on a rainy Tuesday morning almost 2 years before. He had entered Morning Brew just as she was preparing to close, completely soaked from the storm and shaking from the cold. Customers at that hour were typically angry and rushed, wanting their coffee immediately before heading to their significant careers. Tyler was not like them. He gave her a genuine smile, not the quick, dismissive look she was so used to. He wanted to know her name. For a $4 coffee, he left a $20 tip. He returned the following day, and the day after that one as well. For a woman who had been overlooked, thrown away, and hurt for her whole life, Tyler's focused attention felt like feeling the sun's warmth after an eternity of cold darkness. He memorized the way she liked her coffee. He asked about Lily by name. He actually listened when she spoke of her quiet dream to one day have her own flower business. Olivia had learned not to trust people. 27 years of hardship had taught her that lesson thoroughly. Yet, Tyler was incredibly patient. He never pressured her. He made no demands. He just kept appearing, day after day, showing her that he was different. After 3 months, she finally said yes to a dinner date. The first 6 months together were flawless. Tyler was thoughtful, giving, and fiercely protective. He brought toys for Lily and took them both for outings to the park every Sunday. He would hold Olivia as she cried over the surgery she could not pay for. For the very first time in her memory, he made her feel like she was not entirely alone in the world. And then, slowly, the wonderful facade started to crumble. It began with small things. Tyler needed to know her location every minute of the day. He would go through her phone when he thought she was not paying attention. He expressed his dislike for her conversations with male patrons at the coffee shop. He would question her need for 3 jobs, insisting that he could easily provide for them both. Olivia knew these warning signs. She had witnessed them in the foster system, at the youth detention center, and in all the bleakest parts of her upbringing. Still, she convinced herself that she was just being paranoid. Tyler was in love with her. He was simply being protective. The first occasion he struck her was precisely 1 year after their first meeting. She had returned home late from the cleaning job, completely drained and too tired to pick up his repeated calls. Tyler was inside her apartment waiting, having made a copy of her key without her permission. Their disagreement quickly intensified. His hand struck her face so fast she never even registered the motion. In the aftermath, he wept. He begged for forgiveness. He swore on his life it would never be repeated. But it was repeated, again and again and again. When Olivia finally found the strength to leave him, Tyler would not allow it. He began appearing at her places of work. He would trail her on her way home. He would stand on the sidewalk across from her building late at night, just looking up at her window with a vacant stare that held a promise of future violence. And then he became a member of the Black Cobras. Olivia learned of this when Tyler trapped her in a narrow alley behind Petal and Vine. He was working for Viper now, he told her. He informed her that he now had real power. He had influence. And if she ever dared to call the authorities, if she ever even thought about running away, he would ensure that Lily was lost to the foster care system for good. "You are mine," he breathed into her ear. "You always have been." From that day on, Olivia would check the dark street from her window every single night before she dared to turn off the lights. And every single night, Tyler was out there, positioned across the street, watching her, waiting. He never made a move. He simply stood there. That, in its own way, was the most frightening part. A letter came on a Monday. Olivia had just ended her shift at Morning Brew, her feet throbbing with pain and her head aching from a profound lack of sleep. She checked her mail on the way to her apartment. There were bills and advertisements, and a single white envelope bearing the hospital's insignia in the corner. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. "Dear Miss Bennett, this correspondence is to notify you that the surgical procedure for Lily Bennett will require a deposit of $15,000 to be paid within 30 days. Any failure to submit this deposit will lead to the cancellation of the surgery and her removal from the active surgical list." The text on the page swam before her as tears welled up in her eyes. $15,000. In 30 days. She possessed $12,000 in savings, money that represented 3 years of brutal self-denial. How could she possibly come up with an extra $3,000 in just 1 month? She was already working every available hour. There was nothing more of herself left to sacrifice. Olivia barely reached the bathroom before she completely fell apart. She collapsed onto the cold tile, shoving a fist against her mouth to choke back the sound of her sobs. Lily was in the other room, absorbed in cartoons. She must not let her little sister see her like this. Lily already bore too many burdens for a 6-year-old child, burdens of doctors and needles and the confusing pain in her own chest. She did not need the additional burden of knowing her big sister was breaking. That night, Olivia arrived home from cleaning at midnight, with every muscle in her body protesting. She assumed Lily would be sound asleep, but the small girl was awake in her bed, holding a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for you," Lily announced, offering up her crayon creation. Olivia accepted it with an unsteady hand. It showed two stick people, one tall and one very small, holding hands directly under a vibrant rainbow. The words "Liv" and "Lily" were written above them in shaky letters. "Do you love it?" Lily asked, her large brown eyes studying her sister's expression. "You were so sad today. Are you still sad, Liv?" Olivia managed to form a smile, though it felt as if her heart were cracking into a million pieces. "No, sweetie, I am just very tired." Lily immediately climbed into her lap and wrapped her little arms tightly around her neck. "When you are not so tired anymore, can you smile for real? I really like it when you smile, Liv." Later that night, Olivia held her little sister close until the girl finally drifted off to sleep. She lay there staring at the familiar water damage on the ceiling, listening to the gentle rhythm of Lily's breathing, and she did something she had not done for many years. She prayed. She begged for some kind of miracle, for an escape, for anything at all that could alter their desperate circumstances. She had no way of knowing that the next day would be the absolute worst day of her entire life, but also the very one that would set a new course for everything. Her miracle was on its way. But to get to it, Olivia would first need to endure hell one last time. The following evening began just like all the others. At 9:30 at night, Olivia was down on her hands and knees at a downtown law firm scrubbing old coffee spills from a plush, expensive rug. Her back was screaming, her eyes were stinging with exhaustion, but she did not stop working, because stopping was never an option. Lily was at home, safe. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman next door, had promised to listen for her through the paper-thin walls between their apartments. The arrangement was not perfect, but it was the best Olivia could do. Her phone vibrated inside her pocket. She ignored the first buzz, assuming it was just another marketing call, but it vibrated again, and then again. When she finally retrieved it from her pocket, she saw Mrs. Patterson's name illuminating the screen. Olivia. The old woman's voice was shaking with fear. "There is someone in your apartment." I heard yelling. I heard Lily start to scream. The heavy mop fell from her hands with a loud crash. Olivia began to run. She did not bother with the elevator. She flew down the stairwell, taking 2 steps at once, slammed through the emergency exit door, and bolted down 6 blocks of unlit Chicago streets. Her lungs were on fire and her legs burned, but the only sound in her head was Mrs. Patterson's panicked voice. I heard Lily start to scream. The door to her apartment was hanging open when she finally got there. Tyler was standing in the center of her small living room, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and his own fury. His eyes were red and unfocused, his face contorted into something that was barely recognizable as human. And Lily was huddled in the far corner, her tiny frame pressed hard against the wall, with silent tears carving paths down her terrified face. There she was. Tyler's words were a thick slur as he turned to Olivia, a smile spreading across his face that made her entire body go cold. "My girl finally decided to come home." Olivia's voice trembled, but she forced her spine straight. "Get out of my apartment, Tyler." He let out a harsh, nasty laugh. "I saw you earlier. You were at that flower shop, smiling at some other guy." His hands tightened into hard fists. "Do you really think you can replace me? Do you believe for a second anyone else would ever want you? We are finished, Tyler. We have been over for months. You need to go." She tried to step toward Lily, to shield her sister from the monster filling the room, but Tyler moved faster. He seized her arm, pulling her back with a brutal force that ripped a cry from her throat. "You don't get to say when we're finished," he snarled directly into her face. "I do." The first blow landed squarely on her cheekbone. Olivia's head whipped to the side as a starburst of pain exploded inside her skull. She staggered but did not fall. She could not fall. Not while Lily was watching, crying, and needing her to be strong. The second punch slammed into her stomach, forcing the air from her lungs and folding her in half. Tyler grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her head back violently. "If I cannot have you," he hissed beside her ear, "then nobody can." He shoved her, sending her crashing to the floor. His boot connected with her ribs once, then twice, then a third time. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth as the room began to spin in nauseating circles. Through a fog of agony, she could hear Lily's terrified screams. She felt small hands tugging at her arm. "Liv, Liv, stop hurting her. Please stop." Oh no. Lily could not be here for this. She could not witness this. Olivia fought to open her eyes, to make her vision focus on her little sister's horrified face. Tyler was now unbuckling his belt, his eyes completely empty of anything human. Lily. Her name was a broken, bloody whisper. "Run! I am not leaving you! Run!" Olivia screamed, using every last ounce of strength she had. "Go get help. Go right now!" Lily hesitated, her little body shaking, tears streaming down her face. Olivia met her sister's eyes, truly saw her, and spoke the only words that mattered anymore. "I love you, Lily. Now go." Lily turned and ran through the open door, not daring to look back as the sickening sounds of fists hitting skin resumed behind her. She bolted down the flights of stairs, her bare feet smacking against the frigid concrete. She had no idea where she was running. There was no plan in her head. Her only thought was that Liv was hurt. Liv was bleeding badly, and she had to find someone who could make it stop. The night air struck her like a sheet of ice. Late autumn in Chicago was brutal, with the temperature dropping close to freezing. Lily was wearing only a thin cotton nightgown, her favorite pink one with the little white flowers. She had no shoes and no coat. Within moments, the frozen pavement stole all feeling from her feet. But she did not stop running. The South Side was a completely different world after dark. Streetlights sputtered or were entirely burnt out. Dark shapes shifted in alleyways. Far away, a siren wailed its lonely song. Lily raced past men huddled for warmth in doorways and past groups of teenagers who yelled words she could not understand. She ran by storefronts that were locked down with heavy iron bars across their windows. Find help. Find someone strong. Find someone who can save Liv. Her 6-year-old mind cycled through every possibility. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs was too old to help. The police station was much too far away to reach. She did not know anyone else in the world. She did not trust anyone else. Liv had always warned her never to talk to strangers, to never trust anybody in this neighborhood. But then she remembered something from 3 weeks ago. She and Liv had been walking past a very fancy restaurant downtown. Lily had stopped to gaze at the brilliant lights, the sleek, expensive cars, and the men in dark suits who looked like they were from the movies. Liv had grabbed her hand and pulled her away with urgency. "Never come near this place," Liv had warned, her voice strained with fear. "The most dangerous people in the whole city eat there. Promise me, Lily. You have to promise me you will always stay away. The most dangerous people." Lily's frozen feet continued to move. Her lungs felt like they were on fire. Her heart was beating so hard it echoed in her ears. A strange idea clicked into place inside her young mind, a piece of logic that could only make sense to a desperate child. Dangerous people were strong people. Strong people were powerful. And a powerful person was exactly what she needed to stop the bad man who was hurting her sister. She needed to find the most dangerous person in all of Chicago. She ran for 8 blocks. 8 entire blocks through the city's most treacherous neighborhood. A tiny girl in a nightgown now stained with blood, leaving tiny, bloody footprints on the icy sidewalk. When she finally made it to the Velvet Crown, her legs were about to collapse beneath her. A huge man in a black suit stood guard at the entrance. He looked down at her first with confusion, and then with complete disgust. "Get lost, kid. We do not allow beggars here." Lily tried to squeeze past him, but he blocked her path effortlessly. "Please," she gasped for breath. "My sister," he repeated himself. "Get lost." So Lily did the only thing she could think to do. She bit him. Her small teeth sank deep into his hand with all the force her jaw could muster. The guard yelped in shock, yanking his arm away. In that single moment of opportunity, Lily dove under his arm and burst through the grand doors, straight into a room filled with monsters, and into the path of the most dangerous man in Chicago. 8 blocks on bare feet, in below freezing weather. A 6-year-old child running all alone in the dark toward the one place she had been warned to never, ever go. It was the most profound display of courage Dominic Caruso had ever seen. 5 black sport utility vehicles tore through the streets of Chicago like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Red lights were meaningless. Speed limits did not exist. Dominic's drivers knew every back road, every alley, every possible shortcut to cut seconds from their travel time. A drive that should have taken 20 minutes was over in just 7. Dominic held Lily on his lap for the entire ride. Her small frame was pressed tightly against his chest. She had stopped crying, but she could not stop trembling. Every few seconds she would whisper the same 3 words. Please hurry. Please hurry. Please hurry. The apartment complex was exactly the hellhole he had imagined. It was a crumbling ruin, a monument to poverty and total neglect. Crude drawings covered the walls. Many of the windows were boarded up with plywood. The stench of rotting garbage and human despair was a thick presence in the air. This was the place they called home. This was the reality Olivia returned to every single night. Dominic carried Lily up 3 flights of stairs, his men forming a protective circle around him. The door to apartment 3B was hanging wide open, barely attached by a single hinge. They had arrived too late to catch him. Tyler Ashford was gone. Dominic could hear the faint sound of footsteps pounding down a stairwell at the opposite end of the hall. The coward must have heard the cars and fled like the rat he was. But Dominic hardly noticed Tyler's escape, because the instant he stepped inside that apartment, nothing else in the world mattered. Olivia was lying completely still on the floor. A pool of blood spread out from under her head, a shocking splash of red on the filthy linoleum. Her face was nearly unrecognizable. One of her eyes was swollen completely shut. Her lips were split and bleeding. Dark purple bruises were already beginning to form across her cheekbones. Her arm was bent at an angle that made Dominic's own stomach clench. She was not moving at all. For one horrifying suspended heartbeat, he was certain she was dead. Then he saw her chest rise in a shallow, painful breath. It was barely there, but it was enough. Dominic had been surrounded by violence for his entire life. He had ordered it, he had committed it, and he had built his entire empire upon it. He believed he was immune to its horrors, that he was hardened past the point of being shocked by anything. He was wrong. This was different. This was not business. This was not a rival who understood the rules of the game. This was a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong except for simply existing. A woman who worked 3 jobs just to care for her sick little sister. A woman whose only transgression was trying to get away from a monster. And the apartment itself told the rest of the tragic story. The cracked plaster, the broken heater, the insects that scurried away into the shadows. This was their life. This was the battle Olivia fought every day. Something ancient and truly terrible awoke inside of him. A rage so pure it felt like ice burned in Dominic's chest. Lily scrambled out of his arms and rushed to her sister's side, collapsing onto her broken body. Liv, Liv, wake up! I brought help for you! Please wake up! Olivia's one good eye fluttered open. Her gaze found Lily, and only Lily, as her cracked lips began to move. Are you okay? Did he hurt you at all? Beaten nearly to death, and her very first thought was still for her sister. Dominic knelt down next to them, his voice impossibly steady despite the hurricane raging inside him. She is safe. You are both safe now. He turned his head toward Marco, who was standing frozen in the doorway. Call for an ambulance. St. Mary's Hospital. Tell them I am on my way personally. Then Dominic did something he had not done since Sophia died. He gently gathered the broken woman into his own arms and carried her. As he lifted Olivia from that blood-soaked floor, he looked down at her shattered face and made a silent, unbreakable promise. The person who did this would pay for it with every single thing they had. St. Mary's Hospital was the most prestigious private medical facility in all of Chicago. It also happened to be owned in its entirety by Dominic Caruso. The convoy of sport utility vehicles pulled up to the emergency entrance at 10:47 p.m. A team of doctors and nurses was already assembled and waiting. Marco had called ahead of them. And when Dominic Caruso made a call, people moved without hesitation. In a matter of seconds, Olivia was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and whisked away through the automatic doors, surrounded by a swarm of medical experts. Dominic followed right behind, still carrying Lily in his arms. He paused at the main desk, where a nervous administrator was fumbling with a clipboard. "Mr. Caruso, sir, we are going to need some insurance information and a VIP suite." Dominic cut him off sharply. "I want your best surgeons, your best equipment, your best everything." His eyes were like chips of ice. "And if anyone dares to ask about payment, you will send them directly to me. Is that understood?" The administrator nodded his head frantically and then hurried away. The next 3 hours became the longest of Dominic's entire life. He sat in the private waiting area just outside the surgical wing. He was surrounded by expensive art and deep leather chairs that felt grotesque in that moment. On a small sofa next to him, Lily was curled up, her feet carefully bandaged by a gentle nurse. She hugged a hospital pillow tightly against her small frame, her gaze locked on the double doors that had closed behind her sister. Not a single word had escaped her lips since they had gotten there. Dominic observed her from the corner of his eye. She was so tiny, so breakable, yet she had done something tonight that grown men twice her size would not have the courage to do. She had charged through a living nightmare to rescue someone she loved. He spoke softly. "Your sister is going to be all right." Lily's eyes remained fixed on the doors. "How can you be sure?" "Because the very best doctors in this city are taking care of her as we speak." The silence stretched. Then, in a voice so faint it nearly shattered him, she asked, "Do you promise?" Dominic started to speak, to give her a hollow comfort without any real commitment. Promises were a liability. Promises could shatter. He had learned that painful lesson 10 years ago when he stood over 2 fresh graves. But then her brown eyes finally turned to him, and they were filled with a desperate, pleading hope he knew far too well. He heard the words leave his own mouth. "I promise." It was the first real promise he had made to anyone in a full decade. It was as if something inside Lily's small body finally let go. The crushing tension she had carried since she had stormed into the velvet crown at last released its hold. Without saying another word, she leaned to the side, her head coming to a gentle rest against Dominic's powerful arm. In just a few minutes, she was sound asleep. Dominic remained perfectly still. He hardly dared to breathe. This small child, who had every right to be terrified of men like him, had instead decided to grant him her absolute trust. The simple weight of her head on his arm felt more immense than any burden he had ever shouldered. From across the room, Marco stood in complete, stunned silence. In 15 years of loyal service, he had never once witnessed Dominic Caruso display such tenderness to another living soul. The Reaper never gave comfort, he never made promises, and he certainly did not let children fall asleep on his shoulder. But on this night, everything was different. At 2 in the morning, the surgeon finally came out. Olivia was stable. He listed her injuries: multiple severe bruises, 2 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, and considerable facial trauma. But she was going to live. She would require rest and a great deal of time to recover. Dominic gave a slow nod, being extremely careful not to disturb the child still sleeping peacefully against him. He knew, however, that the night's work was far from finished. There were still things to do, and there were people who had a debt to pay. While Lily slept and Olivia began her recovery, Dominic got to work. He took over an unoccupied office on the hospital's administrative floor, quickly converting it into a temporary operations center. His men moved with quiet purpose, entering and leaving to gather intel, place calls, and pull on the threads that would reveal the entire story of what took place that night. By 4 in the morning, Marco had pieced it all together. Tyler Ashford, Marco started, sliding a thick folder across the wide desk. 29 years old, bounces between jobs, no marketable skills. But about 6 months ago, he got involved with the Black Cobras. Dominic opened the folder. Tyler's picture stared up at him. It was a handsome face, the kind that concealed a deep rot just beneath the surface. The kind of face that could easily trick a woman into trusting him. He answers directly to Marcus Reeves, Marco went on. On the street, they call him Viper. He manages the South Side territory for the Cobras. They are small players compared to us, but they are expanding. They have been moving into new protection rackets, loan sharking, all the usual business. And Olivia, Marco paused for a moment. That is where this gets messy, boss. He produced another document. It was a collection of financial statements, surveillance photos, and a timeline that laid out a truly disgusting plan. Viper knew about the little girl's heart condition. He knew about Lily's surgery. He knew exactly how much it would cost. And he knew Olivia was desperate to find the money. Marco's jaw clenched with anger. He had Tyler get close to her deliberately. The whole relationship, even the abuse, it was all just a part of the strategy. Dominic's hand went still on the file. Explain. Viper's plan was to offer Olivia a loan. It would be enough to cover the surgery, but with an interest rate she could never hope to repay. Once she inevitably defaulted on the payments, he would own her. He would force her to work off her debt. Marco stopped, letting the implication hang in the air. There are very few ways a young woman can repay that kind of debt to men like Viper. The silence that filled the room was thick and suffocating. Dominic finally understood. Tyler was not merely a violent, jealous ex-boyfriend. He was an instrument, a weapon used to isolate Olivia, to manipulate her, to break her spirit until she felt she had no other option but to walk right into Viper's carefully laid trap. The protection money she supposedly owed, the constant threats, the stalking, it was all engineered to drive her towards that one single outcome. The $2,400 she owes in protection fees, Dominic stated quietly. It all goes to Viper. Every single cent. He has been draining that entire neighborhood dry for months. Olivia was just a target of special interest. Dominic shut the folder and stared blankly at the wall. His expression was a mask, but deep inside, something cold and ancient was beginning to stir. It was the exact same feeling he had experienced 10 years ago when he first learned who was responsible for taking his mother and his sister from him. Boss, Marco said, shifting his weight uneasily. What are your orders? Call Viper. Dominic's voice was placid, far too placid. Tell him I want to arrange a meeting tonight, 2 in the morning, at the old warehouse on Industrial. Marco nodded, but then he paused. And Tyler? We already have teams looking for him. He could not have gone far. Dominic rose to his feet, buttoning his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate precision. Tyler can wait. I have something very special in mind for him. He walked over to the window, gazing out at the Chicago skyline as it began to glow with the first light of dawn. For 10 years, Dominic Caruso had made every decision based on cold, hard business logic. Every choice was calculated, every move weighed against its potential for profit and power. Emotion had been banished from his world. But tonight was not about territory. It was not about money or respect or expanding his vast empire. Tonight was deeply personal. Sunlight poured through fine silk curtains when Olivia finally opened her eyes. For a brief second, she believed she had to be dreaming. The ceiling above her head was a perfect, clean white, not cracked and stained with water like the one in her own apartment. The sheets that covered her were impossibly smooth and soft, and the room smelled of fresh flowers instead of garbage and damp mold. And then the pain arrived. Every single part of her body screamed out in protest when she attempted to shift her position. Her ribs felt like they were on fire with every single breath she took. Her left arm was heavy, sealed inside a hard cast. When she slowly raised her right hand to her face, she felt the texture of bandages, the puffiness of swelling, and the taut lines of stitches. The memories rushed back in a torrent. Tyler, the savage beating, Lily's screams. Lily. Olivia's heart constricted with a fresh wave of panic. She tried to push herself up, letting out a sharp gasp as agony tore through her midsection. Where was Lily? What had become of her little sister? Did Tyler get what he deserved? A tiny voice came from her right side. Olivia turned her head, slowly and painfully, and saw her sister curled up on a leather sofa, wrapped in a blanket that likely cost more than their entire monthly rent. Lily. Tears began to stream down Olivia's bruised and swollen cheeks. "Oh, thank God! Lily, you are safe!" Before another word could escape her, the door swung open. A man entered the room. He was tall with dark hair, and he wore a suit that radiated wealth and immense power. His face was a hard, unreadable mask, with eyes the color of steel gray that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing at all. A thin, pale scar traced a line down his left cheek. Olivia's deep-seated survival instincts flared to life. She tried to force herself into an upright position, to place her own body between this imposing stranger and her sister, but her broken form refused to obey her. Pain exploded through her ribs, wrenching a cry from her damaged lips. "Do not." The man's voice was quiet, yet it held an undeniable command. "You will rip your stitches." "Who are you?" Olivia's voice was a raw, broken rasp. "Where am I? What is it that you want from us?" The man came to a stop at the foot of her hospital bed, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. "My name is Dominic Caruso. You are in St. Mary's Hospital, and it was your sister who came and found me last night." Olivia's gaze shot toward Lily, who was now fully awake and watching them both with those enormous brown eyes. "I do not understand," Olivia managed to whisper. She ran for 8 blocks through the cold to find someone to help, barefoot and all alone. Dominic's attention shifted to the small child. "She found me." The meaning of his words began to slowly settle into her mind. Dominic Caruso. Even in her isolated world, Olivia recognized that name. The Reaper, known as the most dangerous and powerful man in all of Chicago. "I cannot," Olivia's voice cracked with despair. "I have no money. I cannot possibly pay for this private room or the doctors or any of this. I have absolutely nothing left." "I am not asking you for payment." Olivia just stared at him, bracing herself for the other shoe to drop. There was always another shoe. No one ever does something for nothing. "What do you want from me?" Dominic was silent for a long, drawn-out moment. Then he looked over at Lily once more, and something unreadable flickered deep within his cold eyes. "That little girl walked straight through hell just to save you. She is 6 years old, and she showed more courage than most of the men I know." He then turned his gaze back to Olivia. That was his only answer. Then he turned and left without saying another word. Olivia remained on the bed, her eyes fixed on the door he had just closed, trying to process the encounter. Throughout her entire life, every kindness shown to her had carried a hidden cost. Every person who offered a hand eventually came back to collect their due. For the very first time, a person had helped her and demanded absolutely nothing in return. In a strange way, that reality was more terrifying than anything she had ever faced before. 2 hours passed before a doctor entered with news that would fracture Olivia's world all over again. Dr. Chen was a woman in her 50s with a kind face. Her hands were gentle, and her eyes held the sadness of someone who had witnessed far too much suffering. She checked Olivia's vital signs, carefully examined her wounds, and then delivered the diagnosis with a calm professionalism. "You are healing remarkably well. Taking everything into account, the ribs will need 6 to 8 weeks. Your wrist will take about the same amount of time. The cuts on your face should leave very little scarring if you follow all the care instructions." She paused, her gaze dropping to the clipboard she held. However, there is something else that we must discuss. A chill went through Olivia's veins. Lily, she asked, is she all right? Did something bad happen to her? We conducted a series of tests when she was brought in last night. It is the standard protocol for any child who enters our facility. Dr. Chen's professional demeanor softened, replaced by a look of deep sympathy. Miss Bennett, your sister's heart condition has worsened considerably since her last examination. The words struck Olivia with the force of another physical blow to her already fractured ribs. What are you saying, worsened? The defect is advancing more quickly than we had anticipated without a surgical procedure. Dr. Chen paused for a moment. She is going to need the operation within 2 weeks, possibly 3 at the absolute latest. If we wait any longer, the damage to her heart could become permanent. 2 weeks. Olivia had been relying on having several months, perhaps even a year, to gather the rest of the funds. 2 weeks felt completely impossible. How much is it? Her voice was so faint it was almost a whisper. The operation, the hospital stay, the follow-up care, and all the medication. Dr. Chen looked down at her notes again. It will be approximately $80,000. That number seemed to hang in the room like a death sentence. Olivia could only stare at the ceiling as silent tears began to slide down her temples and into her hair. $80,000. She had managed to save $12,000. $12,000 was the result of 3 long years of immense sacrifice, of skipping her own meals, of working 16-hour days and surviving on 4-hour nights. It was nowhere near what she needed. I have 12,000, she heard her own voice say. I can get more money. I will work even more hours. I can borrow it. I will do absolutely anything. Please, she is the only family I have left. I will sell everything I own. I just do not know. I will figure something out. Just please, I am begging you. Please do not let her die. Schedule the operation. The voice emerged from the doorway. Olivia slowly turned her head and saw Dominic Caruso standing there. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were locked on Lily, who was playing quietly in a corner with some crayons a nurse had brought for her. Dr. Chen stood up a little straighter. Mr. Caruso, schedule the operation. Get the very best surgeon you have. I do not care what it costs. He finally shifted his gaze to Olivia. I will pay for everything. No. Olivia fought to push herself into a sitting position, completely ignoring the searing pain. No, I cannot let you. You cannot do this. Why? Why would you do something like this? Dominic moved slowly across the room, coming to a stop next to Lily's small art area. The little girl glanced up at him and gave him a smile, a genuine and bright smile, before she went back to her drawing. Why? Olivia asked again, her voice breaking with emotion. I just do not understand any of this. You do not even know who we are. You have no obligation to us whatsoever. Dominic remained silent for a long moment, watching Lily's tiny hand guide a crayon across the page. Someone recently reminded me, he finally said, that true courage can often be found in the most surprising of places. He looked directly at Olivia, truly saw her, and for a fleeting second, she glimpsed something vulnerable behind those cold, gray eyes. Something shattered, something deeply human. You need to rest, he told her. Just heal. Let me handle all of the rest. He turned and walked out of the room before she could even think of a response. Olivia lay there as the tears now flowed without restraint, completely unable to grasp what had just occurred. $80,000. A man she did not know had just pledged to pay $80,000 for a little girl he had met less than 12 hours before. Dominic walked into the hallway, where Marco stood waiting with a phone ready. Viper has confirmed the meeting. 2 a.m. At the warehouse. Dominic gave a sharp nod, his expression hardening back into an unreadable stone. Tonight, there was going to be a final settlement, and Viper was about to find out exactly why people called him the Reaper. The abandoned warehouse on Industrial Avenue was a shadow of its former self. Rust had eaten away at the corrugated metal walls. Shards of glass from broken windows allowed the biting Chicago wind to howl through the space. The concrete floor was a map of cracks and stains from many decades of oil, grease, and other substances better left unidentified. It was the type of location where shadowy deals were struck, and where people occasionally vanished without a trace. At precisely 2 a.m., and two groups of vehicles approached from opposite sides of the industrial district. Marcus Viper Reeves emerged from his black Escalade with the confident posture of a man who saw himself as untouchable. At 32 years old, he had fought his way up from a street-level dealer to become the leader of the Black Cobras, using a mix of raw brutality and sharp cunning. A large snake tattoo was coiled around his neck, its fanged head coming to rest just beneath his jaw, a clear warning to anyone foolish enough to misjudge him. 8 of his most trusted men stood at his back, all of them armed and prepared for anything. Dominic Caruso stepped out of his car with Marco and 4 others at his side. On paper, he was outnumbered and outgunned, but anyone with any knowledge of Chicago's criminal underworld understood that numbers were meaningless when you were facing the Reaper. The two bosses met each other in the center of the vast warehouse floor, their men fanning out behind them like two opposing armies. Viper was the first to speak, a wide, gold-toothed grin splitting his face. Dominic Caruso, in the flesh. He spread his arms out wide, as if he were welcoming a dear old friend. I have to admit, I am truly honored. The Great Reaper himself, coming all this way down here just for a meeting. And for what? His grin twisted into something cruel. For some cheap whore and her sickly little brat. The silence that fell over the warehouse was absolute. The silence was absolute. Then, with a single, unified motion, all 4 of Dominic's men produced their firearms. In the hollow expanse of the warehouse, the sound of safeties clicking off was a final, deadly promise. Dominic himself did not move a muscle. He stood with his hands locked calmly behind his back, his face a mask. But his cold steel eyes, blazed with a fire that was both ancient and terrifying. "Say her name like that again," he warned, his voice a low and steady threat. "I dare you." For the first time, Viper's smug confidence faltered. His men shifted their weight, their own hands hovering anxiously near their weapons. The atmosphere became thick, crackling with a tension you could almost taste. "Whoa, take it easy," Viper said, holding up his hands in a fake surrender. "No need to get all worked up. My point is, you are Dominic Caruso. You control half of Chicago. Why do you even care about some unknown girl from the South Side?" Dominic took one deliberate step forward. That single motion was enough to make Viper's men recoil instinctively. "Let me be perfectly clear about what I know," Dominic stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth. "I know that you have been draining the very life out of that neighborhood. You take protection money from people who can barely manage to buy groceries. I know that you specifically go after the desperate single mothers, the elderly, anyone who is too vulnerable to defend themselves." He took one more deliberate step. "I also know that you learned about a little girl who has a serious heart condition. And I know you sent one of your pathetic thugs to get close to her sister, to manipulate her, to wear her down until she felt like she had no other option but to come crawling to you for help." Viper's smile had vanished completely by this point. "That is just business, Caruso. You, more than anyone else, should be able to understand that. Business." Dominic reached inside his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He opened it with care, revealing a child's crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands underneath a colorful rainbow. "Do you want to know what separates you from me, Viper?" He held the drawing up for him to see. "I have done horrible things. I have hurt many people. I have built an entire empire founded on fear and on blood." His jaw muscle clenched tightly, "But I have never, not once, ever targeted women and children. That is a line I refuse to cross. That is a line that no real man ever crosses." Viper let out a snort. "You have become soft, old man, getting all emotional over a few scribbles from some kid." Dominic very carefully folded the drawing again and placed it back into the inside pocket of his jacket, directly over his heart. This drawing was created by a 6-year-old girl, a little girl who ran 8 blocks through the freezing cold, barefoot and in her pajamas, just to get help for her sister. She walked right into a room filled with killers and did not even flinch. His gaze locked with Viper's. That is what real courage is. That is what real strength looks like. And you? You are nothing more than a coward who preys on people who are unable to fight you back. Viper laughed, a raw and ugly sound that echoed in the empty space. Those are big words coming from a man who is outnumbered. What exactly are you planning to do right here, Caruso? He waved a hand toward his 8 men. Every single one of them now had a hand resting on their weapon. Viper was convinced he held the advantage. He believed this meeting was a discussion between 2 equals. He had absolutely no idea what Dominic had already set in motion. Dominic allowed the silence to stretch, letting Viper's contempt fill the vast empty space before he finally responded. "This is how things are going to be," he declared, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "First, the Black Cobras are to abandon the South Side entirely. You will vacate every street corner, every city block, and every single building. This takes effect right now." Viper's expression shifted, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. "You have to be joking." "Second," Dominic pressed on, ignoring the interruption completely, "you are to return all the protection money extorted from that community for the past 2 years. Every last dollar goes back to the shopkeepers, the families, and every person you have bled dry. That amounts to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Third," Dominic's voice became a low, dangerous growl, "you will find Tyler Ashford, no matter what hole he has hidden himself in, and you will deliver him to me. Personally." Viper's face cycled from amusement to disbelief and then settled on a look of rising alarm. "You are certifiably insane, Caruso. I am not giving you anything." Fourth, Dominic closed the remaining distance between them, stepping so near that Viper could witness the icy rage burning within his gray eyes. "You will go to Olivia Bennett and you will apologize to her in person, while you are on your knees." A wave of stunned quiet washed over the entire warehouse. Then, a chuckle escaped Viper's lips, growing into a loud, derisive laugh that bounced off the decaying metal walls. "You are completely unhinged," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You show up here with only 5 men, clearly outnumbered and outgunned. Do you actually believe you are in a position to make demands?" He gestured dismissively toward his own crew. "I have 8 soldiers here who are ready to fill you with lead at my command. Tell me, what is actually preventing me from ending the legendary Reaper tonight and claiming everything you own for myself?" Dominic offered no reply. He just lifted his right hand and crisply snapped his fingers. The surrounding darkness was violently erased by light. Powerful industrial floodlights fixed to the warehouse walls flared to life all at once, bathing the area in a harsh, sterile whiteness. And in that sudden glare, Viper finally saw what he had failed to see before. 30 men. They materialized from the deep shadows, appearing from behind corroded machinery, descending from the high catwalks, and stepping out from concealed positions all around them. Every man was heavily armed. Every weapon was aimed squarely at Viper and his crew. Before any of the Black Cobras could even think to draw their firearms, they were completely surrounded. Dominic's team operated with cold, military precision, disarming Viper's soldiers in a matter of seconds. They forced each man down to his knees, one after another, hands secured behind their heads, their threat utterly neutralized. Viper was left standing by himself in the middle of the warehouse floor, suddenly feeling intensely small and exposed. "You were saying something?" Dominic's voice was soft, almost conversational. "Something about me being outnumbered." The last of Viper's courage dissolved completely. His eyes frantically scanned the warehouse, desperately seeking an escape, a weapon, anything at all. But there was nothing. He had come to this meeting assuming the role of the hunter. He was now the prey. Dominic walked toward him at a deliberate pace, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the now silent warehouse. He came to a stop just in front of Viper, close enough to see the beads of sweat forming on the younger man's brow. "You are presented with two options," Dominic stated calmly. "Option 1, you comply with every one of my demands. You give back the money. You bring me Tyler. You apologize to the woman that your animal nearly beat to death. After that, you will leave Chicago and you will never set foot here again. If you do all of that, I will let you live." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Option 2, you can refuse. And then I will give you a demonstration of exactly how I earned the name Reaper." Viper's knees gave out from under him. He collapsed onto the oil-stained concrete floor, all of his previous arrogance gone. His hands were visibly trembling at his sides. The serpent tattoo on his neck seemed to twist as he swallowed with great difficulty. "I will do it," he managed to choke out. "Everything you said, all of it. I give you my word." Dominic just stared down at him, allowing the terror to fully saturate Viper's being. "If you go back on your promise," he said at last, "there is no place on this planet where you can hide from me. I will hunt you down, and what I do to you then will make you beg for something as merciful as death." Viper gave a series of frantic nods, hot tears now tracing paths down his cheeks. By the next sunrise, the black cobras were gone from the south side, as if they had never been there. Viper himself had fled Chicago in the middle of that same night, abandoning everything he had worked to build. He was never seen again. But one final person still had to answer for his actions: Tyler Ashford. They located Tyler Ashford cowering in a Greyhound station at 4 in the morning, clutching a one-way bus ticket to Detroit. He never made it onto that bus. Dominic's men intercepted him in the dimly lit parking lot, forcing him into a dark sport utility vehicle before anyone even realized what was happening. Tyler screamed and fought and pleaded, but his desperate cries were swallowed by the empty night. He was brought to a warehouse on the west side, a different location from where Viper met his downfall, but no less intimidating. It was a place with concrete walls and no windows. In the center of the room sat a single chair, bolted directly to the floor. Tyler was already strapped into that chair when Dominic made his entrance. The man who had beaten Olivia Bennett to within an inch of her life now looked utterly pathetic. His face was a sickly pale, streaked with tears and mucus. His expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and soiled. He was shaking so uncontrollably that the metal chair rattled against the concrete floor. Dominic stood before him in total silence, letting the thick atmosphere of fear grow heavier. "Please," Tyler finally whimpered out. "Please, you do not get it. I am in love with her. I have always been in love with her. I did not mean for it to happen. I just lost my temper. It was just a mistake. A mistake." Dominic's voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Is that what you call beating a woman until she is unconscious? A mistake? I was drunk that night, and I was so jealous. She was laughing and talking with other men, and I just—" Tyler's excuses came tumbling out in a frantic, jumbled mess. "I love her. Everything that I did, it was all because I love her so much." Dominic kneeled down, putting his face on the same level as Tyler's. The younger man recoiled violently, trying to press himself into the hard steel of the chair as if he could somehow melt into it. "Love?" Dominic repeated the word softly. "You believe that love is about controlling a person, isolating them, and hitting them until they cannot even recognize their own reflection in a mirror?" "She is mine," Tyler spat, a flicker of his old entitled rage showing through his terror. "She belongs to me. She will always belong to me." The slap was so swift that Tyler never saw it coming. His head jerked violently to the side as blood burst from his split lip. "She is not a piece of property." Dominic's voice was as cold as ice. "She is a human being. She possesses the right to say no. She possesses the right to walk away. She possesses the right to live her life without being afraid of the very man who claims that he loves her." It was then that Tyler completely broke, sobbing uncontrollably like a small child. "Please do not kill me. Please, I will do anything you ask. I will leave Chicago forever. I will never try to contact her again. I swear, please." Marco took a step forward, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "Boss, what are your orders for him?" Everyone present in that room was certain they knew the answer. Tyler Ashford had harmed someone under the protection of Dominic. Safety. The penalty for violating that trust was brutally simple: a single gunshot, a hasty burial, and a name that was erased from memory. Dominic, however, shook his head slowly. A quick death is a mercy Tyler does not deserve. He stood to his full height, gazing at the shattered man slumped in the chair with pure disdain. "You will continue to live, Tyler. You will have the next 15, perhaps 20 years to do nothing but contemplate four concrete walls. With every sunrise in your cell, you will remember precisely what brought you to this place. Every time you close your eyes at night, you will see her face, the one whose life you shattered." He glanced at Marco. "Contact Detective Morrison. Inform him we are sending him a present. The entire evidence file, medical reports, all the photographs, and sworn witness accounts, everything required for a conviction that cannot be appealed." 3 weeks after that night, Tyler Ashford received a sentence of 15 years in a state penitentiary for aggravated assault, stalking, and domestic battery. Dominic observed the media report from the solitude of his office. There were fates far more agonizing than a physical ending. To live with the burden of your guilt, with the unyielding consequences, with the crushing heaviness of your actions, that was the ultimate punishment. Dominic was intimately familiar with this truth. For 10 years, he had endured the pain of losing Sophia and Isabella. Certain wounds are never meant to heal. They simply become a permanent part of your identity. 6 months can redefine a person's world. On a radiant spring morning, Lily Bennett burst through the entrance of Chicago Children's Hospital, her arms outstretched as if she were a plane soaring. Her feet, the very same ones that had been cut by frozen asphalt, were now adorned with bright pink sneakers that flashed with each joyful leap. Her laughter bounced off the walls of the lobby as she spun around and around, delighting the nurses who had attended to her. The operation was an unqualified success. Dr. Chen described her recovery as extraordinary. The condition that had put Lily's life in jeopardy was gone. Her heart was now beating with a strong, consistent rhythm. She was free to run. She was free to play. She could finally be a regular 6-year-old girl for the very first time. From the hospital doorway, Olivia observed her younger sister. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks. Yet, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were tears of pure happiness. Her entire world was different. On Madison Street, where a little flower boutique named Petal and Vine had once been, a brand new sign now hung over the entrance. It read, "Lily's Garden." The glass windows gleamed in the daylight, showing off beautiful arrangements of roses, lilies, and sunflowers. Inside, the atmosphere was rich with the scent of new blossoms and endless possibilities. Dominic had purchased the storefront for Olivia, without even consulting her. When she attempted to decline the gesture, he merely placed the keys in her hand and departed. "Think of it as an investment," was all he had said. "I will require a fresh bouquet every Sunday." For the first time since she was just 17, Olivia was no longer juggling 3 different jobs. She had one job, her very own enterprise, established with her own effort and filled with her own aspirations. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, she was a student at Chicago Community College studying business management. Dominic covered all of her tuition costs. She gave up trying to argue with him about it after her 3rd try. The South Side itself had been reborn. After the Black Cobras vanished, the community started to breathe again. Store owners who had operated under a cloud of dread now greeted one another with smiles. Youngsters could be seen playing on the sidewalks long after the sun had set. The extortion money that had drained families of their resources was returned, down to the last dollar, exactly as Dominic had ordered. Nobody was certain of the details. Whispers circulated about a turf war between rival crews, or a formidable man who had arrived and wiped the slate clean. The people who lived there did not probe for answers. They were content to savor the tranquility. A few of them referred to Lily as their little angel, without fully grasping why. They simply felt that this vibrant young child was somehow connected to their newfound freedom. Every single Sunday, like clockwork, a black sport utility vehicle would park in front of Lily's garden. Dominic would emerge, holding flowers for Olivia. They were always her favorite kind and always perfectly fresh, plus a small treat for Lily. He would remain for a couple of hours, sipping coffee and listening to Lily's tales from school. He would watch Olivia create beautiful bouquets with hands that were no longer scarred. Marco could not help but see the profound shift in his superior. The icy exterior had started to melt. The fortifications around him showed cracks. A glimmer of humanity had broken through the Reaper's facade. "You have changed, boss," Marco commented one evening while they were driving away from the shop. Dominic offered no denial. He just gazed out the window at the glow of the city. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. It was, perhaps, what occurs when the deepest darkness finally encounters its own source of light. The Sunday afternoon sun streamed into the windows of Lily's garden, painting the room in liquid gold. The small flower shop on Madison Street was not open for business. Inside, however, 3 individuals were gathered for their weekly tradition. Lily was seated on the floor with her legs crossed, encircled by crayons and sheets of paper, her tongue sticking out slightly as she focused on her newest artistic creation. Olivia was positioned behind the counter, preparing fresh coffee with the small appliance Dominic had gifted her the previous month, while Dominic occupied the comfortable worn leather armchair near the window. A newspaper was spread across his lap, but his eyes were not truly on the words. Through the glass, the South Side buzzed with a gentle energy. Kids pedaled their bicycles along the pavement. Neighbors exchanged pleasantries on their front steps. A place that had once been paralyzed by dread now moved with a sense of ease. It had the feeling of home. Uncle Dom. Dominic raised his head from the newspaper. Lily had set aside her drawing and was now gazing at him with her large brown eyes, the same eyes that had met his in the Velvet Crown months before. "Yes, little one, I want to ask you something." She scooted toward his chair and hoisted herself onto the armrest, an act Olivia would typically discourage. But on this day, neither of them uttered a word. "Why did you help Liv?" The question settled in the quiet room, simple yet profound. Olivia's movements paused over the coffee machine. She did not look over her shoulder, but Dominic noticed the new stiffness in her posture. He could feel her holding her breath, awaiting his reply. He folded the newspaper and set it aside, turning his full attention to Lily, truly seeing her vibrant, rosy cheeks. He saw the brilliant life force in her eyes. He saw the total lack of fear in her tiny frame. She was entirely unaware of what she had accomplished. She could not know that her single, desperate act of bravery had irrevocably altered the paths of 3 separate lives. "Because someone reminded me," he explained very deliberately, "that every darkness has to have a light." Lily tilted her head, her expression puzzled. "Who told you that?" For the first time in a decade, Dominic Caruso smiled. It was not the frigid, strategic expression he reserved for his dealings. It was not the mask he presented to the world. It was a true smile, full of warmth and sincerity, though it was slightly fractured around the edges. "A remarkably courageous little girl," he answered in a soft voice. "She was 6 years old. She had no shoes and a ripped nightgown, and she accomplished something that nobody else in the whole city possessed the nerve to do." Lily's face crinkled as she considered this. "She sounds really cool. Do I know her?" Dominic let out a soft chuckle, a genuine laugh that sounded rusty from lack of use, but it was completely real. "You could say that." Olivia finally pivoted from the counter, the coffee forgotten. Her gaze locked with Dominic's from across the shop. In that single look, a universe of unspoken thoughts was exchanged between them. There was gratitude, a deep understanding, and something more profound that neither was prepared to give a name to. For 27 years, Olivia had carried the belief that she was not meant for happiness, that her fate was to endure, to struggle, to get by, but never to truly flourish. She had constructed barriers around her heart that were just as formidable as Dominic's. But in that moment, seeing Lily giggle at something Dominic whispered to her, feeling the gentle warmth of the Sunday sun on her face, enclosed by flowers and optimism and the promise of a new day, she finally grasped the truth. She was worthy of this. All of them were. Sometimes the most delicate hands possess the greatest strength to change the world. And there are times when rescuing another person is the very thing that saves us. This was the tale of a small girl who sprinted 8 blocks through the night to confront a monster and found a guardian angel in his place. It is the tale of a woman who lived a lifetime of being broken, only to learn that shattered fragments can be reassembled into something even more beautiful. And it is the tale of a man who believed his humanity was lost to him forever, until a child's bravery showed him that it is never too late to let love conquer fear. There are individuals in our world at this very moment, perhaps some of you viewing this, who feel just as Olivia did, feeling cornered, without hope, and certain that nobody is listening and that things will never improve. But if there is one lesson from this story, it is this one. Assistance can arrive from the most unlikely of sources. Bravery can reside in the most vulnerable of hearts. And regardless of how deep the darkness of your night feels, the sun will always rise. If there is someone you know who is struggling, please connect with them. If you are the person who is going through a hard time, please understand that you are not by yourself. The final page of your story has not been turned. The most incredible chapters might still be ahead of you. We would love to hear your voice. What emotions did this story bring up for you? Did it bring to mind a person in your own life? Have you ever had an experience where an act of kindness from a stranger changed your entire day? We invite you to share your reflections in the comments section below. We read each and every one, and your personal accounts motivate us to continue making content that connects with people and serves as a reminder of the kindness that still flourishes in our world. If this narrative resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with a person who might need this message today. Each like, every share, and all subscriptions enable us to keep bringing you compelling stories about hope, second chances, and the resilient nature of the human spirit. Thank you very much for joining us all the way to the end. Your time and your focus mean more to us than we can possibly say. We wish you wellness, joy, and tranquility in your everyday existence. We hope you discover your own light when things seem dark, and that you find the strength to become a light for someone else when they need it the most. Please look after yourselves and be kind to one another. Farewell for now, and we look forward to seeing you in our next story. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons